Good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, when someone said, how long is your presentation? Is it 20 minutes? Because actually your slot is an hour. I thought, yeah, that's not just the graveyard slot, but you've given me the shovel to dig my own grave. Thankfully, we're not going to. I don't need to spend that whole hour and giving you my thoughts on the seafood supply base. But what I am here to do is spend the next 20 minutes talking about a little piece of work that we've been involved in over the last 18 months or so. Hans ended off his presentation, if you recall, just before the lunch period, with the line of attaching the importance to origin. And it's quite a strong thread in Hans' presentation about Norwegian seafood, about the quality, about the provenance, and so on and so forth. And also within that presentation, he mentioned the fact that consumers aren't too aware of where their seafood is coming from. So I'm going to talk about this piece of work, which delves into that a little bit deeper. So I'll just briefly mention the background and the approach taken to this piece of work, some of the key findings, and the high-level conclusions and next steps. It's very much a work in progress, and this is just drawing a line in that process. But first off, why do this piece of work in the first place? So I'm in Seafish, I'm involved in leading the horizon scanning work area. There's a lot of disruptions affecting the seafood industry, we all know that. Some of them throwing up opportunities, some of them throwing up threats. And some of them are near in terms of, say, for example, Brexit or shortages of material or what the consumer's doing. Some of them are much further out. But the purpose of the Horizon work area is to try and understand how those disruptions are arising and playing out and what opportunities and threats they might present, and then helping industry respond to those in a timely fashion. So this is just a little excerpt from one of the tools that we use in that process, which is the industry risk landscape, which itself has over 270 risk items identified. And as the Horizon scanning work area goes through the assessment process, you're trying to distill down which are the strategic priority areas with impact for the industry. So one of those priority areas was the supply base. And that's quite a challenging area, not least just in terms of trying to capture that seafood supply base, but just the way that people think about it. Because in the general discourse, people view seafood and the supply either in the short term and quite focused, in a quite focused way, or in the very long term in a fairly broad sense. So, for example, you'll have fishery scientists giving their view on state of a particular fishery, so it's quite unique in its location. And they'll be trying to give a sense of what's needed for the next 12 months or the next 18 months around a TAC limit. And on the other hand, on the industry side of things, contracts have to be delivered within a 12-month, 18-month contract duration. So the focus is quite down into that specific area and part of the supply base. At the other end of the scale, you have the likes of the FAO and the World Bank crunching data and producing assessments and reports on the available seafood supply globally, which is grand. But there is this gap in the middle, which says, okay, given that we've got specific sources of supply, specific supply chains going into a particular part of the landscape, and you've got this broad assessment, what's that part of the landscape that's relevance to the UK? What is the UK's seafood supply base? Okay, so that's part of the challenge in responding to supply as a priority area. So in responding to this, there was a requirement for Seafish to get in amongst this area and look ahead at what the supply base might look like in 15 years or so. Apart from the up and down ongoing fluctuations, we've seen species coming in, going out. What is likely to be on the horizon? What might play out? So the aim of this piece of work was to understand that seafood supply base, coming back to Hans's point, what's our seafood supply base looking like now? Okay, and what does it look like? How could it play out to 2030? What could the impacts be, and what could the response be? And the deliverable normally is to produce a report, but I think this is more of a discussion document. Because this is an evolving landscape, it's important to use it as a line in the sand to say, we think the seafood supply base looks like this. It could go in these directions. Let's have a conversation about that and talk through our response. So the way we scoped this out was to say that the UK has a particular shape in terms of its seafood industry. It's drawing on international as well as domestic sources. We need to reflect that. It relies on capture as well as aquaculture. It's across whitefish, pelagic, shellfish, salmon. We need to reflect that asymmetry. We need to also capture the fact that it's not just a concern for the marine stage, it's a concern for the marine through to the outlet, the whole supply chain. So capturing all of that and the main supply regions in a supply portfolio, what is it that we've got to work with? And in getting to that, a number of tasks. So it's not a desk-based exercise. It's useful to read research reports by the FAO and the World Bank and all these players and all the rest of it. But that's not the only source of knowledge. If we think about the knowledge that's in people's heads in this room, Mike Park mentioned about fishermen and vessels being a platform for science and research. Everybody in this room is a platform for research and science. The experience, the age, the years that have been involved in this industry is useful to draw on. So yes, we're interested in what trends have been picked up on and predicted by researchers, but we're also interested in drawing on industry operators and what they've experienced and what they see that could potentially play out. And in framing the challenge, it's important that we think not just whether supply is available in the water. That's a requirement, yes, but it's not sufficient. We need to consider whether supply is an option, because there are other matters that concern us, not just the fish in the water. Other factors drive supply. So in framing this challenge and trying to investigate the seafood supply base, we're looking at supply availability. Yes, the fish in the water, but also the trading conditions, the regulations, the fisheries governance, marine user opposition. These factors affect availability. Not just that, can we afford to pay for it? The fish might be there, but we might be priced out of it. So again, what's the conditions that are allowing us to access that material? What are the conditions that other countries are in? What are their conditions? They can potentially pay more than we can. Preferences. We must respond to the market requirements there. Certification, scrutiny, that's been a big factor in recent years. Nutrition and safety as well. If we buy a haddock, we expect a haddock. We don't expect Pangasius or another fish in its place. We need to know that what we're buying is truly what we're after. So product composition and nutritional content there. And of course, supply is affected by environmental constraints. Okay, wild capture fish stocks go up and down. That's a natural process. And they have a certain rhythm to them as well. And the human impact that we might bring to bear in fishing for that material as well, the use of gear, for example. And of course, across all of this is innovation. How is innovation easing affordability or being able to deliver on preferences and so on and so forth? So again, that's a factor. And these drivers operate across the supply chain, from the supply region through the species and chain to the markets. So framing it in a kind of holistic way was how we took on this piece of work. So just before I go any further, I mean, this, as you might imagine, the UK seafood supply base is, the industry itself is complex. It's got many supply routes. So it's quite detailed, and what I'm just going to touch on is a couple of high-level results. And the report itself is available on the website, on the Seafish website. But in terms of key findings, just to set out the envelope, as it were, yes, the UK has a very international seafood economy, but it's not everything and everywhere. There are some key regions and key species that are of interest in the main, in the UK portfolio of supply options. This is the material that we take from that world global seafood resource. Red is showing whitefish, of course in the Northeast Atlantic and over in the Bering Sea and down in Asia. Large pelagics in the equatorial regions, small pelagics up in the Northeast Atlantic, shellfish spread also in the Atlantic and farmed material in the equatorial regions, and salmon in pink. That gives us a kind of spread. That's the distribution with our main relationships in the supply portfolio. But over and above that, the UK interests are quite specific. So coming back to what I was saying earlier about the big picture and FAO and World Bank and all the rest of it, the World Bank estimated in 2015 that world seafood production was some 170 million tons. Okay, that's 170 million tons. But not all of that's of interest to the UK. That includes, some specific species, carp, for example, that, maybe we don't have a great interest. It's not a supply option for us. But this table shows what's in the what's available in the water in those areas that I pegged out in that map just before. And that sums up to some 20 million tons. So quite a small proportion of that global big picture amount. And not all of that material is available supply. It's not all of it an available supply option to the UK. I mean, if you looked at the trade data for 2015, you'd see that what we took from that portfolio was between 1 to 2 million tons. Nigel mentioned 3 million tons in 2017, but in 2015, it's between 1 and 2 million. So again, we're not taking all of that, but that's just to give an indication of where the major sources of whitefish, pelagic, shellfish, and salmon, the bits that are of interest to the UK are sitting. And one of the reasons why it's not all available to the UK is because of those supply drivers. Okay, and we've seen that. In our work with, in delivering this work, we spoke to over 35 industry operators, buyers of seafood, and we explored, how did we get to this supply base? How did we get to this portfolio? Why should it look like that? And what's driven it? And we can see that those drivers at work have been coming into play in that table in the last 15 years or so. We've seen options shaped by affordability and innovation in aquaculture species. So the appearance of farmed pangasius, for example, sea bass, obviously warm water prawn, and salmon. Now they've had a dramatic impact, bringing volumes into the marketplace, allowing that seafood to be affordable to UK consumers. We heard in the last session about how price was an important aspect to consumers, and that's been able to facilitate that. But there are also other drivers at work that we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years around market preferences, the growth in scrutiny and certification to give assurance on the supply that's coming through to the UK that it's meeting the market requirements. And we've also seen easing environmental constraints. Okay, so for example, in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen those constraints eased in Icelandic and Bering Sea whitefish. Okay, so that's facilitated our access to that part of the seafood portfolio. But that's the last 10 to 15 years. Now, this is useful, I guess, in terms of being able to say, I mean, earlier on when Nigel Gooding was talking about trade negotiations and, being an independent trade negotiating country, then, it's important to get a handle on what seafood trades are important. So this is a starting point to be able to say, well, okay, this has been what we've relied on in the last 10 to 15 years. And understanding these drivers and how they might play out helps us to respond and take on potential opportunities and see off threats. So it could be helpful in that kind of trade policy arena. It could also be helpful in terms of informing Seafish investments and priorities and projects, and maybe also industry operators in looking at that. But of course, this is an evolving situation. So some of these developments have begun to turn. So, for example, on the environmental constraints on Icelandic and Barents Sea whitefish, although we've had a long period in which there has been buoyant availability in the water, that's beginning to turn. That's been in turn affecting affordability. That's not the only example, but generally there is this question about prices beginning to creep up. And the price trends that were shown by Simon earlier today, again, highlighted the recent increase in fish prices, and notably salmon as well. I think we've all seen that in terms of the salmon price. Again, the earlier innovations and advances in that production is perhaps coming to its limit in the current technical capability. So the next question is, where's the innovation frontier there? Where's the next expansion of that envelope that can maintain that affordability? So whilst it's interesting to look back and say, okay, where have we had our seafood supply from? And what is the nature of our seafood supply portfolio? What does it look like? That's not the whole story. We need to get on beyond that. And one of the questions we asked seafood operators was, given that storyline, given that narrative, okay, where's it going to go next? Where do you see some of these pressures and drivers playing out? What do you think might be in the water in 2030? Now, I'm not expecting you might be able to read that, particularly at the back of the room, but the top half of the table is showing the domestic sources of fish. The bottom half of the table is showing the international sources of fish. And what that color coding is showing against those key species is whether or not there might be much higher proportion of fish in the water than there is currently, ranging from red, which is much less, through to green, which is much higher. So the first impressions from the operators, this is the operator's view, given their experience, given their awareness of the drivers of supply, is it's generally optimistic. It's generally in the green kind of area. There are some exceptions. Some of those exceptions in the domestic sphere, for example, is around haddock, because that supply tends to go up and down in a quite volatile manner. Hard to kind of see where that might end up. Some of those species, like brown crab, in the shellfish side of things, are data deficient, so it's difficult to actually know how much is there. In the international sources, again, there's a little bit of a question mark about cod and haddock from the Barents Sea and Iceland. A little bit less committed to how that might play out, but there are some other areas that are notably positive and notably negative. Okay. There's two negative aspects there, tuna and cold water prawn, and there's some quite strong elements, mussel production in UK waters, and perhaps cod from the Western Atlantic, and definitely warm water prawn. But of that, so that's the more positive items, and they are the more negative items. But what of those will be a supply option for the UK? Because that's not the whole story. If we think about UK domestic mussel production, the drivers there are around innovation and new offshore production, for example, in Lyme Bay. I think that's been successfully demonstrated. If there was scope to roll that out into wider production levels, that would obviously deliver more material. But that is subject to the market being able to absorb that. In the current situation, the UK market for mussels is relatively small compared to the European market, but you've also got a pressure around affordability in making that material available to those markets, not least with Brexit. So if there's trade tariffs come into play, then there may be a challenge to actually taking that material to market. This is the interaction between these drivers that I was talking about earlier. On warm water production, again, continued advances in technology and understanding of warm water prawn production likely to improve availability and affordability if more volumes come into play. Innovation in production may also play a part in that. So the emergence of warm water prawn in recirculating aquaculture systems, as I understand it, could then free up where that production takes place. It could take place in non-traditional countries. And of course, disease better managed as well. So although there's a view on where fish might be in 2030, whether or not that's a supply option for the UK depends on some of these other drivers at play. And understanding those drivers allows us to think about, well, how could we respond to those? On the more constrained point around tuna, that's around availability. That's a high-value species, obviously, and there's weaknesses in the fisheries governance and trading conditions, potentially with Brexit. And increasingly, perhaps, affordability. Because it's a high-value, sought-after species, and we have a growing middle class globally, then that potentially begins to bring price into the equation in terms of our ability to buy that material. And if there's continued weakness in fisheries governance, then the condition of the stocks will become a factor as well. Cold water prawn has, over the last 5 to 6 years, oh, no, more than that actually, 8 to 9 years, I've been on a bit of a decline in terms of its stocks. That's anticipated to continue. So again, there's going to be some real constraints on that particular source. So that's just a little, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, that whole supply portfolio has got a narrative behind each of those line items in that portfolio, what's happened in the last 10 to 15 years, what's expected to happen. And that's in the full report. So that's just a little flavor of a couple of standout items. But what do we draw from this? Well, these are high-level conclusions, operate as generally positive in their longer-term future supply availability, but there's important exceptions to this. There are specific developments and specific places that could be game changers. So Canadian cod, for example, it's subject to environmental conditions and it's rolling on, and there may be or there may not be a supply option there, but if there does turn out to be a supply option, that could be a potential game changer in terms of the availability of whitefish. Farm salmon, I mentioned earlier about the production frontier, the innovation frontier there. If offshore salmon production gets ramped up, then does that free up more material, keeping the price of salmon within reach for consumers? So there's some specific developments that may change that stakeholder view of fish supply in 2030. But it's also subject to more general conditions and how they play out. So I mentioned the growing middle class and their effect a little bit earlier. But of course, that could have quite a dramatic effect if that accelerates. There was some newspaper headline recently about, 50% of the world population is now middle class. And so the ability to buy that fish, even if it ticks the boxes of all those other aspects, being able to buy that fish vis-a-vis other potential buyers is a potential game changer in terms of that fish profile to 2030. And climate change as well. Climate change is in the news. It's been in the news recently in terms of how that's playing out. How that is affecting the aquatic resource is not a well-known area. There's quite a lot of speculation in terms of temperature rises, in terms of fish migrating, and so on and so forth. But there may be some other more dramatic changes in terms of ocean currents, which would destabilize well-known fisheries behaviors. So that's a potential game changer as well. And of course, nearer to home, Brexit plays a role and how that affects the portfolio. But at least understanding that portfolio is a starting point to say, okay, let's now think through Brexit problems and opportunities. So it's a disruption, but there's threats and there's opportunities, primarily around availability and affordability. Okay. In terms of how that then challenges the industry, it obviously challenges individual supply chains ongoing, but domestically, those in the domestic sphere, particularly being challenged on availability and affordability. So what was mentioned earlier by Mike Park about access, about relative stability, about having a share, a greater share in that resource is key. But also affordable supplies, being able to deliver that material at an affordable price to the UK market, to export markets, is going to be key also. Again, bringing in the question of trade tariffs. Market preferences aren't going to go away, so it's not a case of just dumping that onto the shore. It has to have the requirements of certification, scrutiny, and that can all be assisted through innovation. It was mentioned in the earlier presentations around new technology, being able to cut the cost of delivering seafood. So that's all in there to play for as well. Internationally, and securing material from that international part of the portfolio is that trade-off between what's available, what's affordable vis-a-vis other countries increasingly able to pay for seafood, and the environmental constraints, because the environmental constraints are important to our particular markets. So that throws up a number of questions. What do you do about it? What should be the response? And there were some suggestions as part of our work to identify the kind of responses needed in those different supply routes. So a number of practical actions for Seafish, but also for industry, and maybe also for government, particularly now that DEFRA are getting more involved in seafood and international trade and so on and so forth. There's a question, I suppose, why look at 2030? Why should you be focusing that far out? Why shouldn't you be focusing on 2020 or 2022? Well, that's not to say that that's not relevant, but you heard at the opening address of Ursula's presentation about the growing number of frameworks that are either Seafood 2040 or a 2030 vision in Scotland or what have you. Increasingly, there is a conversation to be had between industry and government about, within the industrial strategy work that's going on, about us articulating what is needed and what will be done with government support and so on and so forth. And so this is potentially a contribution to that and articulating what we might aspire to and what we need to do. But this is a dynamic landscape, okay? I mentioned this at the beginning. This is just a line in the sand. It's a piece of work. It's a first step in understanding that landscape's on the web, but things move on. So there's a question of keeping up with that changing landscape and keeping up with that changing landscape in an engaged way. So that it's not just Seafish doing some work. It's actually Seafish and 35 or 50 operators buying seafood, expressing what they think and how that might play out, and gathering that knowledge in and being able to articulate it to each other and to government. So the report is just a start, and Seafish and stakeholders needing to maintain that conversation. And in doing that, Seafish can maintain a watching brief. Okay, so keep the conversation going. It's not a report necessarily, it's a conversation. How has that 2030 profile changed? How is it likely to change in the next 12 months? What's new? What's continuing? What's coming from the side? What's expected and what's unexpected? So we're keeping on top of it. We can also do more forensic research. So that's quite a broad piece of work. It's quite wide. And you might be thinking, well, that's quite generic. I need to get in amongst that and know a little bit more detail if my business is to respond to any of these opportunities and threats. And so in the challenge work that we've got in our corporate plan, we will follow this on with potentially more specific research in parts of that portfolio. Okay, this is not something that Seafish has been involved in years past, but with Brexit and a number of other challenges and pressures on board, it's increasingly coming into our orbit, as it were, from our importers and processors panel, our Horizon Steering Group, to be able to say, what is that seafood supply base? What is likely to be happening in that space? The report, as I mentioned, is available on the website. It's at that address. You can have a look at it. It's quite a read. It'll take longer than an hour. If you don't have time to read that URL or take it down, just visit the Seafood Horizons webpage on the Seafish website, and you'll find it there. Okay. Or get in touch. There's my details.